I'm mindful of people's time, and we're going to lose people at various intervals here. So I want to get going, despite the fact that we're still seeing people joining. I'm very pleased that you all are here today with us. I'm representing the Gulf of Mexico University Research Collaborative, or GOMERC, and I'm also, for my day job, I'm professor and dean at the LSU College of the Coast and Environment. And I've been around a lot of time, so I've done a lot of things, and you can read about them there. Well, next slide. Just a little bit about GOMERC. GOMERC is an organization that I, Bill Hogarth, Larry McKinney, and several others formed in response to the oil spill. We felt that the universities around the Gulf need to come together and represent our interests in terms of the science and research that had to go on with respect to the oil spill. And so we got every state represented. And right here, you can see the current representatives in the in GOMERC, and we aggregately represent about 80 public and private universities around the Gulf states, some of which participate heavily and others of which do not. But it's been a pretty successful organization. We've even gone to Capitol Hill together to lobby for the Restore Act. So it continues to be good. I felt that since a pressing problem that has not been addressed adequately is unrepresented minority hires and things like that, and education, in particularly in our geosciences, I thought we should be doing something to get together and discuss that. So I put together this workshop with a lot of help from other people, and I do want to particularly mention Kathy Falls and Hannah Ehrman, who has been very helpful in getting this going. Most of you probably are generally aware of the problem that we do not have very many PhDs being graduated who are either are one category or another of undergraduate unrepresented minorities. In the case of Black African Americans, it's really dismal. It's the worst performing of all the STEM areas. And if you look at Latinx, it's a little better, but it still substantially underrepresents the population in the country. Next slide. So today we want to, I'm moving fast because I want to save time for our speakers. We want to try to find ideas that we can use to enhance PhD production in the physical and environmental sciences. And again, the physical sciences are more broadly the geosciences. I found that three things are very important in helping minority students: mentorship, networking, and communication. And we'll be hearing from our speakers about that, and we'll be discussing it in a couple of breakout groups that we're going to have after our plenary session. So we also hope to share information via our GOMERC website on diversity action plans, for example. We have one for our college that I'm pretty proud of, and I'm glad to share ideas with other people, and I'm eager to see other people's ideas. Graduate program opportunities, employment opportunities. We've got to find a place for these students to go, and I think if they're looking for academic appointments, there are going to be lots of opportunities for them. Scholarships and other funding opportunities, scholarships both at the undergraduate and graduate level, and also postdoctoral, and other available resources to help really make networking and all these other things possible. Ideally, I would like to see us develop some sort of a fundable proposal. Maybe we can get the National Academy's Gulf Research Program interested. Maybe we can get NSF interested, who knows? But I'll be anxious to hear your ideas. Next slide. So here's the agenda. I'm giving the overview right now, obviously. We're next going to hear from Isaiah Warner of LSU. We're going to hear from President Larry Robinson of FAMU. We're going to hear from Emeritus Dean Peter Betzer, and then two students who were in that Bridge to the Doctorate program at USF, Dr. Nikisha Williams and April Ellis. And I think it's going to be an interesting session. So let's keep going. I want to make sure there's time for them. This came from a wonderful report that APLU did recently, showing the complexity of how people get from a high school all the way into academic jobs, get doctorates so they can be hired. And it's complex. And there are lots of inflection points and connections where one could have influence. And I suppose most of us have tried a variety of levels to deal with this pipeline problem. Today, I would like to focus particularly on how to get more students into graduate programs so that they can go on and get a PhD and are eligible for being hired at universities. So if you would focus your thoughts on that, I would appreciate it. Next slide. Now, we can look at demographics from a positive way or a negative way. You can say, well, we've got a problem that there are a lot of people that aren't involved. Well, we can also say we've got an opportunity because we have a lot of people to involve. And I would rather look at it that way. If you look at the Gulf states rankings for percentage of Black residents, Mississippi and Louisiana are number 1 and 2, and Alabama is pretty high on the list. Florida and Texas aren't so high. However, if you look at Latinx residents, you'll see that Texas is number 2 and Florida is number 6. So we have a lot of opportunity in terms of potential students that we can reach. And we know historically that these are pretty endemic populations. They tend to want to stay near where they came from, where they grew up, and be near relatives and friends and things like that. We also have American Indian opportunities as well, and we can exploit those. Next slide. If you look at the percentage of bachelor's degrees earned by states, or the numbers actually in this case, you see that the southern states are falling behind many of the states to the north. And that means that we obviously have to get more students into bachelor's degrees so we can draw from that. But we still are seeing healthier numbers than we used to. In my own undergraduate program here at LSU, our Coastal Environmental Science program, we're starting to see more minority applicants now than we ever did before. And I view that as a hopeful sign. Next slide. Now, that's enough for me. I want to give the others a chance to talk. My colleague and friend, Isaiah Warner, is one of the great masters of mentorship I've ever known in my life. He's responsible for mentoring more African-American PhD students than I think anybody else on the planet. He is a Boyd professor and also vice president for strategic initiatives at LSU, and has a most distinguished record. With that, I'm going to just let him get started, and I want to hear from him more than me.
Are you going to allow me to share my slides, or is that already allowed?
I think you can do it. Kathy,
it's already allowed.
Already allowed? Let's see. Share screen. Okay.
Looking good.
So you can see it?
We can see your Zoom. You may have shared the wrong screen. Do you have 2 screens?
Yeah, I have 2 screens.
I think you may have shared the wrong one. There it is.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk about a new center that we've started. And in that entire effort, I'd like to, at the end, encourage you to join us in the center because it's open to partnership, particularly for those universities that are situated in the South. Our center is called Ellis Pack Model Center of Excellence, and I'll explain that to you in a minute. Okay, before I do that, I wanted to tell you a little bit about chemistry. LSU chemistry, before I arrived in 1992, and you can see when I arrived on that chart, that was sudden burst of African-American PhDs because I brought 10 students with me, 5 of whom were African-American. And I won't go through the whole details, but suddenly in a university that never had more than 6 African-Americans at one time, they had 11. And before that, we had only graduated a total of 3 African-American PhDs. You look at these numbers now, we were averaging 30 for many years. That's dropped off some, but I think that's going to pick back up a little. And you see it is cyclical. When you get a burst, graduate out, then you go down and then you build back up. But the point is that before 1992, we had never had more than 3 African-American PhD. Now we're approaching 100. And so no more than 6 PhDs, I'm sorry, no more than 3 in the program at one time. But the numbers are approaching 100, which I think is astounding. But we're not the only ones that recognize that. That was an article in Journal of Chemical Education published a few years ago that ranked us number 1 in the percent of PhDs awarded to women, and also number 1 in the percent and numbers of PhDs awarded to underrepresented minorities, primarily African Americans. And you can see why that's true based on the numbers that I just showed you. So on that basis, we wrote a proposal to develop some of the activities we've done in chemistry, as well as some of the activities we've done with undergraduates. And we wanted to establish a center. And what is that center? I talked about the LSPAC models. It is the Louis Stokes Regional Center of Excellence, which is dedicated to preparing underrepresented minority students for academic careers in STEM. What we do, we desire to develop and disseminate best practices for diversifying the STEM workforce. And this is funded by the National Science Foundation. And so, let me go back here. And here, my staff that's working on this. We have 5 PhDs. Dr. Tirsla Williams has a PhD in chemistry. Dr. Robert Markle is the overall head of the center. He has a PhD in English, but has a strong affinity for the sciences. Dr. Kristen Williams graduated from one of my undergraduate program, PhD in chemistry. Dr. Karen de Graveles has been working with me for a number of years, left and went to teach for a while, but is back. She has a PhD in English, and of course, myself. So our vision is to create a nationwide evidence-based model for increasing underrepresented minority students who are successful in academic STEM careers. Now, in order to do that, we have to increase the retention to graduation rate of underrepresented minority STEM PhDs. And we want to develop a national model for increasing this number of URM STEM PhD recipients. So why diversify the professoriate? Certainly, persons who are URM should have individual academic and career success. And we look at the numbers now, those numbers are dismal. There should be meaningful progress on issues, including sustainable energy. I mean, people have shown that the more diverse a science group, the more productive and creative that group is. So we want to contribute to that creativity. However, if we look at the URM population, underrepresented minorities, 31% of the population, but only 9% of STEM faculty and 3.9% of bio and chem faculty. And there is disproportional access to similar role models as a result, and mentors and informal networks. So diverse research teams produce higher impact research, as I mentioned. This is a number of studies, but this is one particular study that supports that contention, but there are a number of others. High opportunity costs and loss in talent if we have people starting towards STEM careers and they don't complete those STEM careers. What are our objectives? How will we do this? First of all, we want to facilitate systemic mentoring through an innovative mobile application and website. We are in the process of developing that application and website. And I would say we're halfway through now. In fact, we're about ready in the next month or so to essentially put the model, a demonstration model up. We want to provide networking opportunities for scholars and mentors. We want to provide academic support structures through professional development and study social and networking strengths in successful students. And a lot of this will be done through our mobile app and website. And both of those will be compatible. So what are the activities we're planning? Mentoring, obviously, as Chris mentioned, mentoring is an important activity. I would not be where I am today were it not for mentoring. In fact, I am not only the first in my immediate family to get a PhD, I'm the first in my immediate family to get a high school diploma. So I should not be where I am today. Connecting LSAMP alliances is a major part because we're funded through the LSAMP program, which is the Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation on the NSF. So we have regional networking events, annual conference. We've already had one conference. We had to postpone the last conference because of the pandemic. We will have another conference this summer, and I invite all of you to look into that conference and attend. And we're forming this networking network that I mentioned, Scholar Network, Scholar Mentor, and Mentor Network. And all of this, again, will be done via the app and the website and also in person. Professional development, webinars and workshops, we've already started a number of those. I presented one this past fall on mentoring. And who do we plan to serve? Well, the mentees will be undergraduates, graduate students, postdocs, and early career faculty. And who can serve as mentors? STEM professionals, academia, industry, government, and STEM senior undergraduates, graduate students, postdoctoral fellows. And just to show you how that mentoring will work, we will have peer mentoring, where undergraduates will mentor other undergraduates, graduate students will mentor both undergraduate and their peers, postdocs will mentor undergraduates, graduate students and their peers, junior faculty, et cetera. I think you get the idea. And senior faculty will be involved in all of the mentoring. And on this website, we will have characteristics of the mentees. What are they looking for? We will also have characteristics of senior faculty. And these senior faculty will not just be residing in the South, they will reside all over the country. And so the mentee can go into the app and select a series of mentors that they might be compatible with, and then try to establish a relationship. And we should have thousands of mentors by the time we finish, and certainly thousands of mentees. So what are the benefits for the students? They will have access to STEM role models. We want to get them into academics. So we would like a lot of these role models to be academic types. Website and mobile app for matching, as I indicated, for interacting with mentors, including goal setting, messaging, and video chatting. We want to form a network of URM STEM students and mentors around the entire country. Opportunities to present at LSPAC Models conferences and workshop, professional development, webinars and videos. and they will have access to STEM students and mentors around the country, website and mobile. These are for the mentors, the benefit of the mentors. Website and mobile app, professional development on mentoring, and resources on mentoring and best practices in STEM. I'd be glad to answer any questions. If you want to take this information, we also form LSPAC Models partners. You can go to our website and feel free to join in as a partner. And as a partner, you will have access to our workshops and all the information that we will be sending out regarding any activities. So I'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
We have time for a couple of questions, perhaps. If you don't get your question in, just send it to us as a chat item, and we will make sure that it is forwarded to the speaker and they can answer. So, Isaiah, let me start by just asking a quick question. We've talked
Sure.
a lot about the idea of one institution graduating an undergraduate that then goes to another institution to get a PhD, and then we can hope they'll come back to the original institution to be hired on the faculty. I know you've talked about that model before, and that model is being discussed in the SEC right now at the provost level. Can you
Right.
provide any more ideas on that?
Yeah, well, she asked me for my proposal, and I hope someday she'll acknowledge where that idea came from. So I gave her my LSPAC Models proposal. And so that idea comes from my proposal. Basically, what we're talking about is working with universities, primarily in the South, and it's not just restricted to SEC University. In fact, the universities we have to work with are the LS-AMP universities, and not all SEC universities or LS-AMP university, but most of them are. And basically, that model is based on an undergraduate program that I didn't talk about, where we train students who are now getting PhDs at remarkably high level. We started out with, we had about 250 students, not quite that, 249 maybe. And about 74% of those students are getting advanced degrees. In fact, some of them have gone on to work in industry and then come back and say that they want to go on and get their PhDs. We have a number of students that are doing that. And those students recognize we started them off as freshmen doing research, and they missed that activity, creating new knowledge. And so what we want to do is have a group of students, particularly LS-AMP students, since we're funded by LS-AMP, students that we will train in that same fashion to go on and get PhDs and eventually want to go into the professoriate. And because we don't take our own students, we can put these students into a pool where all of the participating universities can take students from that pool. So participating university, let's say Florida, might have an outstanding underrepresented minority that we would be interested in hiring in on as a faculty member. So if we have a pool of students that we can then attract to the professoriate from out of that pool, and not necessarily our own students, then we're creating a pool of potential PhDs for academics.
Great. It's a great idea, and I think it's something that we really should consider in GOMERC, because our particular discipline has so much difficulty in attracting students.
I would welcome you to participate in our center, and we would work directly with you. I mean, GOMER is certainly among the kinds of opportunities we're looking for in terms of working with students that are interested in STEM. It doesn't matter to us what areas of STEM. We know that underrepresented minorities are seriously absent in almost all areas of STEM.
Fantastic. Well, you count on us. We'll be participating. Okay, I want to keep moving just so that we get everybody the amount of time they need. Again, we'll pass the questions along to the speakers if you didn't get your question answered.
Okay.
So,
And I'll stay around for Larry's talk. I think it's next, and then I'll have to bow out because I have a meeting. I
okay,
hope that meeting's at 2:00 Central Time. I may be missing the meeting right now.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Sure.
And now it's a great honor and privilege to introduce President Larry Robinson. I first met Larry when he had the amazing timing to go to NOAA at the time of a major oil spill. And now he's president of Florida A&M at the time of COVID. I think he's a glutton for punishment, but we're really grateful that he's able to take time from his schedule to talk about the topic of how HBCUs and minority serving institutions relate better to institutions like most of our Gomer crowd. Larry.
Well, thank Chris. I don't have a presentation, and I really feel bad following, one of the icons in this area, Isaiah Warner, who has been a role model for me over my career. I am also a chemist officially by training, and so Isaiah has really motivated, tons of folks beyond the ones he's touched directly at LSU and at Emory. So
I don't know if you know, one of my students has just joined your faculty.
I didn't know that. But,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean. So
Chemistry.
anyway, I feel really small following out Isaiah, but I'm gonna give it my best shot anyway. So the title of my talk is supposed to be, improving the pipeline and interactions among HBCUs and Gomer universities. And so I would probably put a subtitle to that saying, don't let the past stifle what could be a productive future, right? But at the same time, don't totally ignore, some of the tragedies we experienced in the past and in the present to the detriment of us moving forward as partners. So let me begin by saying that in order for this to work, I feel like it needs to start with a vision, from the highest level. If you want to talk about institutional collaborations, that's where it's going to have to start. However, as scientists, as many of you are, you don't have to be a provost, dean, or president, right, to get things done in spite of perhaps that struggle that goes on, at an institutional level. I came to Florida A&M University in 1997 after spending 12 years at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which was at the time managed by Lockheed Martin. And we had a number of programs that reached out to minority serving institutions, HBCUs, to increase their, participation in the STEM workforce that we had at the National Laboratory. And so I spent a lot of time, either hosting faculty or students from HBCUs, visiting HBCUs, including Florida A&M University, which ultimately led me to come here to try to get over, some of those barriers. And so when I came to Florida A&M, I was the rector or professor of the Environmental Sciences Institute. And one of the first challenges I encountered is that there was a major solicitation, that the Department of Energy had. And I knew some people at Florida State University. I had known them long before coming here. And I developed a proposal in partnership with them. And then when they got to some of the powers that be, they said, well, wait a minute, what's this about, right? Not realizing that, it was a collaborative partnership that was going to be mutually beneficial. We actually got beyond that, but it took a while because of some of that history. In 1997, a small group of HBCU presidents or designees met with NOAA officials at the time to talk about how NOAA could take better advantage of the talent we had in our institutions to help NOAA with its bottom line and with its lack of diversity. That discussion that started in December of 1997 really led to the formation of what we now call these cooperative science centers. And now David Yoskovich is going to talk a little bit more detail about those in a breakout session. But I'll tell you the bottom line is that those centers have done more to diversify the NOAA workforce in its scientific arena than any other program in its history. And it was done, however, with the commitment at the highest leadership levels. It was also done with an idea in mind of collaboration, and that is we had in many of our HBCUs who were participating in that program back in 1997 some fairly strong and long relationships with NOAA in certain line offices, et cetera. But at the same time, we saw that it was an opportunity to collaborate with some non-minority serving institutions in building, sort of building out our portfolios as well as theirs as well. And so we wound up with a program that created 4 cooperative science centers, and each of those were led by one minority serving institution of one type or the other. There were 3 HBCU leads and 1 HSI lead, and that was City University of New York. The HBCU leads were Howard University, Fordham University, and what is it in Maryland, University of Maryland Eastern Shore. All of us had, minority and non-minority partners, but what was fairly unique about this collaboration on that level is that it was specified in the federal award conditions that the bulk of the resources, right, needed to go to the minority serving institutions because they had the students and they needed the capacity building to expand on the output of students. And so it started with this collaborative planning and program design that benefited NOAA as well as the institutions, as opposed to some of the traditional approaches that I think if you're going to build partnerships through the minority community, here to avoid that idea that we were the government and we have all the solutions figured out. And so when it comes to institutions, you have to recognize that they're very bright, smart persons on all of these campuses, and some institutions might have more than others. They might have bigger boats, in larger capacity, but it's important to recognize that good ideas can come from everyone. And if you want to jeopardize a relationship, you really want to build on those types of utilization of that expertise. The other part of it is, what made this program unique too, is that for the first time, in any history of NOAA, in this particular case, there was adequate funding to really start to have an impact, right? There are a lot of programs that are designed to try to change those awful numbers that you just saw from Chris, but with marginal investments, right? Not only marginal investments, but investments that are not sustained over a long enough period to make a difference. For example, funding, one of our physics professors for 3 years to increase the number of PhDs in physics, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because you all know this is going to take a little bit longer than 3 years in the first place. And so NOAA and the team working together came up with a plan for what was significant in terms of the size of the investment, but also ultimately, 5-year cooperative agreements that allowed students at both the undergraduate and graduate levels to have enough time to get out and get into the world of work. And also too, this investment was strategic in the where and the who. I said earlier, it was important that students of color got a chance to see their own institutions, as well as the faculty members at those institutions, sort of having lead roles in the the conducting of research and serving as research mentors, et cetera. That was very, very important, and it will continue to be important if we really want to build, sustainable partnerships. But I also think too that it's just as important when it comes to engaging minority scientists and students that the work that they do is aligned with and integrated into to what's really important, for that agency or that partnership. To assume that first they're not going to know the difference is a mistake, and then secondly that there are going to be great dividends on the other side of that is also a mistake. I remember at Oak Ridge National Laboratory one summer. In fact, there was a student. We was to host about 30 HBCU students in an HBCU summer program. They would spend 10 weeks or so with us. And I remember one time I was going into, the building where my lab was, and there was a student from Southern University, Isaiah, who I'd met and I had talked to during the summer, and I asked him, well, what are you doing? We were designing this huge world-class, research reactor, and he was an engineering student. And I asked him, what was he doing? He said, well, he was filing blueprints, right? And he was frustrated because he saw, other students from other institutions, designing this and designing that. And of course, when students see that, it's not going to make them very, optimistic about pursuing their career or at the very least, pursuing employment at that particular entity. And so I think engaging students, and whatever we're talking about in that collaboration and something that's meaningful is extremely important for sustainable partnership. It's also important too, and I think Chris, you alluded to this, to have some measure, of goals and metrics. How are you going to measure success? How do you define it? And one of the things that you have to be careful about here, and you take these NOAA centers, for example, if you just want me to produce, scholarly research papers, that's a way to do that without engaging many students. I could hire multiple postdocs or research fellows and do that if that's what you want. But if you want me to enhance increase the number of underrepresented minorities in the NOAA-related sciences, then that has to be one of the metrics that you pay attention to. And of course, the resources have to be designated such that happens. And what's unique about the current cooperative agreement that we have with NOAA across all 4 of these centers is that at least 50% of the funding has to go to direct student support. Of course, a lot of people kick and scream about that. I'm fine with it because I think, in my mind, that's our ultimate goal. However, those students have to be exposed and engaged in the kind of research and that's really important to NOAA. And of course, we don't expect NOAA to hire all of these students, but at the same time, that's sort of the model. If we can get them to work on NOAA relevant problems, they'll be employable anywhere and everywhere, including academia. But I do think beyond all of that, it's important to realize that the life of these students isn't just the time that they're in school, is when they're not on our campuses where we provide them perhaps a nurturing environment that we have to be concerned as well. We lose some students, because sometimes they see a different, side of the complex nature of the world of science, engineering, and mathematics when they're not with us. And so what we had to do, going back to my Lockheed Martin days, it came clear to me that although we had arguably some of the best scientists in the world in what we specialized in at the time, but at the same time, there were some of those scientists who didn't really, who were there because they didn't want to be bothered with students or mentoring students, et cetera, right? And so try to make that work could be a disaster. And I saw some of those over the years. And so we have to be very careful. And, programs like the one that you have, Isaiah, and the one that we have here, we're very careful about, who our mentors are for our students, right? because the things that they do might ultimately make a difference in whether that student decides to persist in the discipline or not. One of the requirements of this program that we have is that every graduate student spend what's called a NERTO, or NOAA experiential and research and training opportunity at an actual NOAA facility. And the reason for that is that NOAA wants them exposed to the world of NOAA, and then of course we want the world of NOAA exposed to them as well, right? And so it gives each each side of that an opportunity to see and explore. But we have to be very careful about those relationships. So we put a lot of work into how those are designed, understanding what the rules of engagement are, and so forth. We even put into the proposal an additional bucket of money, which for me is really significant for those students who might go out to those facilities and spend time away from their campuses to offset the additional cost they may incur for lodging and so forth. One of the most fundamental questions that I used to ask students when it came to going off and doing internships, is how do you make it to the first month's rent, right? How are you going to get there? Because a lot of students, did not realize that they may have been moving from a biweekly pay scale to a monthly pay scale or something altogether different. And many of them were crashing and burning because they didn't have enough money to sustain themselves, even in the short term. And even when they did, it was causing unnecessary frustration. So this new approach put monies in their hands, and then help guide them to finding places of lodging and helping them with transportation and some of the things that you might normally take for granted. But ultimately, it's that environment that they're placed in and the compassion that they feel from the person who's mentoring them at those sites. And I think not only when they're off campus, but on our campuses as well. So ultimately, this program has been, I believe, tremendously successful. We just went through a third year review, a fourth year review. We came through that, extremely well. And I think what was amazing to the external review panel is the fact that 83% of the students in the program at the undergraduate level were underrepresented minorities, and 89% of the graduate students were. Our partners in this experiment are, 3 HBCUs and 3 Hispanic serving institutions. And of course, to me, that makes sense, right? But to others, that doesn't always happen that way, because when you put the type of stipends and programs that we have to offer on the table, students of all types, flock to those, and none of us have any intention to discriminate against any student. So to maintain those kinds of numbers in a program where it has to be open to everybody by definition, I think is an incredible outcome. But it takes people paying attention and deliberately, doing things on the recruitment side and the retention side to make that happen. Let me end there and stop Chris to see if there are any questions.
You're muted, Chris.
I forgot I muted myself. I just wanted to thank you and maybe direct one question to both you and Isaiah, because you both mentioned mentorship. Andy Shepard wants to know what are the challenges to senior faculty mentoring, and how do we get an increased participation from our senior faculty in mentoring?
Yeah, so money work. No, just kidding. I mean, that always helps, but I think you have to appeal to something more. One of the things that's unique about our program is that it allowed us to hire, just for this program, as this person is on the faculty here at Florida A&M University, but has responsibilities across the center. But it recognized that that might be a problem, right? And so we have hired, a distinguished research scientist who helps to influence other faculty to get involved with student mentoring, but also does it himself, right? And so that person's salary, 100% of that person's salaries come out of this award. And you know how atypical that is, 100% of the 9 month salary, at the very least. And I think that helps, right? Motivate others to do it because you have this outstanding faculty member doing it, and it helps to destigmatize, reaching out to minority students. If you're not interested in working with minority students on a Hispanic serving institutions campus or an HBCU's campus, then you really need to move on. That's just the bottom line. You're in the wrong place. You should not have been here, okay? Something is wrong with that, in my opinion. Maybe a different story at LSU, but here is nonsense to think otherwise.
Isaiah,
I,
any thoughts?
I totally agree with Larry. I mean, the first criteria that I tell people who want to mentor students is that you have to believe in the students. And if you don't believe in those students, don't mentor them. If you don't believe that they can succeed, don't mentor them, because you're going to end up instilling ideas that may destroy their self-confidence. And I totally agree with Larry that if you're on an HBCU campus, you should believe in underrepresented students. Otherwise, why are you there? So that's my first criteria.
One other quick question from Julie Swickla. What kind of support or training do you provide mentors, in particular for those who are not URMs but are looking to serve and mentor? Good
Go
question.
ahead, Isaiah. I'll let you start.
Repeat that again, because my buzzer went off.
Okay.
Oh, Chris.
What kind of support or training do you provide mentors, in particular for those who are not URMs but looking to serve and mentor?
I actually have a workshop that I give on mentoring. First of all, I go through my mentoring career and I talk about how I mentor students, and then I do case studies. I've done that. The University, Virginia Tech has asked me to do that. University of Michigan has asked me to do that. But I go through case studies and show impossible situations. There's no way this student is going to overcome it. And so I ask the audience, and sometimes they'll give me an answer that's acceptable, but then I tell them what I did, because they're actual case studies from my own experiences. And they're impossible stories where one young man, for example, graduated from high school with a 2.5, told his advisor that he's going to go to medical school. The advisor laughed in his face. And I was on the faculty at Emory when that young man happened to come in, because he was a really bright young man, but he had run track, hadn't paid attention to academics. He graduated from Emory with a 3.95 grade point average, went on and graduated the top of his medical class at Cornell University. And so I don't write off students. I don't believe that it's impossible for a student to achieve their dream. I think and it doesn't matter about the background. I tell students, if they're willing to, it depends on how hard they're willing to work. Regardless of your background, because like I said, I'm not supposed to be where I am, considering I was in a segregated high school, poorly equipped, wonderful teachers who inspired me to do more, but you have to have people that believe in you.
Yeah, so Chris, we have pretty much ongoing engagement with our faculty across the center. And first of all, I think they have, in terms of the ones who are involved in this particular project, but across the campus in general, this is sort of an ongoing, struggle in a sense, because, we do have a very diverse faculty. They come from all over the world, right? And most people don't realize that on an HBCU campus. It's quite diverse in terms of our faculty, in particular in STEM. And so one of the early challenges that I help some of our junior faculty overcome is, trying to serve as a mentor or a faculty advisor in the way that it happened to them when they were at University X or Y, right? You're dealing with a totally different population, a totally different mindset, a whole different group of sensitivities, right? You know, and you really have to adapt to meeting the students, as they say, where they are, you know, but making them believe that they can do it is a critical part of it. I tell every parent, you know, every opportunity I get is that, you know, the one thing you don't have to prove to us at Florida A&M University, no matter who the student is, what they look like, is that they have the innate ability to be successful at FAMU, where we really start there. And when I taught, they don't let me teach anymore, and the student didn't perform as well as I thought they should have, because I'm thinking everybody's gonna, you know, do well, because I can figure this out. I know they can. Is to bring them in and have a conversation about what am I doing wrong as an instructor, right? To get the message off. I don't assume the student has a problem. I assume it's the way that I'm communicating with the student. And I can't tell you how many opportunities I've had to sort of, you know, figure that out and help the student move along. And we also have, you know, sort of moved away from the era in which, you know, we bragged about, in some instances, you know, in those gatekeeper courses in particular, you know, how many students we failed as opposed to how many students we helped to succeed. And so we're constantly engaged with our faculty on our campus and our students as well, such that if they feel empowered, that if they see something or hear something that doesn't sound right, then they need to let us know so we can help work with those faculty members to understand that the only reason that we are here, right, is to serve the students in the first place. And so it's not as difficult, you know, as it might sound, but it is a challenge, and it's going to be a constant challenge because of the different cultures who are, you know, intermixed in the faculty that we have, in the national faculty, you know, faculty from the states, from HBCUs, from Ivy League schools, et cetera, and trying to get everybody to understand that the culture we're trying to, you know, cultivate here is one that makes every student feel like he or she has the potential to be, you know, get a PhD in whatever discipline they happen to be enrolled in.
Well, I unfortunately have to cut it off now because I'm told I have to move on to the next speaker. So if I could, I want to introduce Peter Betzer, who is the founding dean and dean emeritus in College of Marine Science, University of South Florida. I asked Peter to participate because he is the driving force behind their wonderful Bridge to the Doctorate program that we started during his tenure. So, Peter.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris. This is a special privilege to share experiences about the Bridge to the Doctorate that essentially addressed a very daunting problem of underrepresented minorities in marine science at the University of South Florida. I want to thank Dave Nahr, who was the head of the college's graduate program. He supplied me with a lot of the data that had been accumulated since I retired in 2008. And actually, I sort of felt like I could leave the meeting and turn it to some of our graduates. I took a look out and I saw Karina Rosario, Regina Easley, Nikisha Williams, Catherine Bailey, and these are all people who have gone through our program. The next slide, please. So an aerial view of the research cluster in Bay Borough Harbor, Florida. The peninsula that sticks out there is 11 acres and has almost 1,000 people involved in marine science. Now, I was there for 37 years, except for the 2 years I was at sea. And the next slide shows a group of us that work on Moana Wave. There is, in fact, as you can tell from being in the Pacific, a challenge of trying to use heavy equipment in a rough ocean. And the yellow arrow points to the person who is never going to get any kudos for safety at sea. That indeed was me. Fortunately, we survived the challenges on the Moana Wave, and I got back to Bay Borough Harbor safely. The next slide, please. I'd like to highlight the challenge for the marine sciences is a lot like that for the geosciences. If you take a look at the PhDs that are awarded, there's several thousand for African Americans in all programs. And this is from 2002 through 2005. Ocean sciences, the total doctoral awards goes along nicely in the 90s. But when you look at the African Americans and Hispanic people who get PhDs in ocean sciences, it's pathetic. It's essentially non-existent. And even worse for the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida, we had straight zeros on all 5 years. We graduated no underrepresented minorities in that 5-year period. So we decided in about 2002 that we better confront the challenge. And there were an awful lot of people and groups that got together and it were important to what has evolved in USF's College of Marine Science. The next slide. The marine science faculty, I mean, we've talked about mentors, and they were critical both in marine science and engineering. The Office of Research at USF and the upper administration both provided substantive awards for fellowships for our underrepresented minority students. The National Science Foundation, this is looking at basically the Larry Robinson rule for continuity, support all the way through from 2004 to 2020. And over that period, $8 million has been provided for underrepresented minority fellowships. The Florida Georgia Lewis Stokes Alliance for Minority Participation, all of the NSF money came through that wonderful group. A.B. Sloan reviewed us in 2004. And that year we were provided and made a part of their minority institution network. And that is continued. They continued giving money through 2014 that amounted to about 2.2 million. The Council on Ocean Leadership, their board was very generous. They provided 5 years of fellowship support amounting to $100,000 for fellowships for Bridge to the Doctorate. And our St. Petersburg Downtown Partnership, our business community, you can see the years there a little bit outside the box that I had defined, but they have been crucial boosters to the marine sciences and the University of South Florida essentially forever. We had a host of individual donors, and you'll see some pictures later. And finally, I want to recognize Bernard Batson, who's in the College of Engineering, but he has been a champion for underrepresented minorities throughout this entire era. So even though he's not in marine science, he deserves a lot of credit here. The next slide, please. The person I think that we can all thank for this is Dr. James Hicks, who was at the National Science Foundation for 23 years. Dr. Hicks just stepped down from his desk at NSF, but he was the one who, when he joined in 1997, realized that although there was substantial support for undergraduates in underrepresented minorities, that there was in fact no federal money had for underrepresented minorities that wanted to earn a PhD. So he worked in 2003, Dr. Hicks got substantial amounts of money dedicated and set aside for underrepresented minorities to earn PhDs in universities. The next slide features the champions for this effort that we started at the, no, back one, please. The champions that we had for the Bridge to the Dock people. One slide forward, please. We had people who generated the proposals for the National Science Foundation. We had the people who worked very hard to attract top-notch students. And we also had people, high-ranking people who celebrated this new program that started in 2004. The faculty leaders are in the middle of this image. Dr. Ashanti Pirtle, who was a key person to getting a lot of our talented people like Regina Easley to join our graduate program. Dr. Shakir Bansali from engineering, Dr. Luis Garcia Rubio. In the background, Dr. Ralph Turner and Byron Green of Florida Georgia LS AMP. A much younger Peter Betzer is there, and Rhea Law, who served as the chair of the University of South Florida's Board of Trustees, is in the left front. Of course, the major focus is on the $50,000 check from the St. Petersburg Downtown Partnership that they wrote in August of 2006 to support an endowment that would be for the Bridge to the Doctorate. This was their third $50,000 donation. So this was all made before 2007. So this revolutionary new program got off to a tremendous start. We had federal support, university support, and substantial local support. And we were quite fortunate. We were able to attract a host of talented students. And the next slide shows the group. So we trying to think, you see some of the same people featured. Dr. Pirtle, chair of the Board of Trustees. To the left of Dr. Pirtle in white is Nikisha Williams, who will be speaking shortly, and to her left is Regina Easley, and then Karina Rosario is up there too. So this is a wonderful thing to see what has happened to the people who started in 2006, and now they've moved on and been successful. So the next slide shows what's happened with the Bridge to the Doctorate program over a 7-year period stretching from 2010 to 2016. For all of ocean sciences, so this represents the output from all 40 ocean science programs that have PhDs. There were 25 Hispanic people who earned PhDs and 10 African Americans. At the University of South Florida College of Marine Science, we had 9 Hispanic PhDs awarded and 6 African Americans. So we basically went from none in a 7-year period to 15. The average number of PhDs that were produced in both of these periods from 2002 to 6, 11. And so what happened was we didn't change the total output, but what we did change is the culture of our graduate student society. And for that, I'm really grateful. So we have a lot to celebrate. The next slide. The graduates that we have are university and college faculty members. They're employed by federal agencies, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NASA. They're postdoctoral fellows, and each of these people is a role model for others. And in fact, if you look in the bottom there, you'll see Nikisha, a somewhat younger Nikisha, and she'll be talking just a little bit later. Now, the next slide highlights a few of our graduates, and all of our graduates are scientific role models, but many of them are also people who are changing the culture of our society. There we go. The person on the left, the first year she graduated, she got a multi-year award from the National Science Foundation. She recently produced a TED Talk that was really excellent, and currently works in a genomics lab at the University of South Florida. I mean, it's wonderful when you attract these people from other places and they stay on. Dr. Sinai Haps, University of Virgin Islands, has won several awards from the National Science Foundation that are focused on involving younger people in the geoscience, and that is the younger people that are underrepresented minorities. The person who looked pretty stern there, Regina, that's Regina Easley on an icebreaker taking measurements. Regina is a scientist at the National Institutes of Standards in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and she has an active role in inspiring young women. So these are wonderful examples to the people in the outside world. So not just great scientists, but they're really doing a lot to change the culture of our society. The next slide, please. Both Dr. Robinson and Isaiah Warner stressed the importance of mentors. And the University of South Florida College of Marine Science is blessed to have a bunch of great mentors, two magnificent mentors. On the left, Dr. Pamela Hellickmuller, and on the right, Dr. Maya Breitbart. So they have been productively involved with underrepresented minorities. And as has been stated and is intuitively obvious, these are the individuals who are pivotal to changing the culture, not just in marine science, but in any university. The next slide features the generous donors who basically created a major endowment for Bridge to the Doctorate. This endowment is providing fellowships for underrepresented minorities in the College of Marine Science at the University of South Florida. So what you see, the group that you see in front of you in less than 3 years built an endowment of $951,000. And thanks to these donors, the college will always be able to support 2 underrepresented minority candidates for the doctorate. As I think I mentioned before, the business community, our downtown business community, and there are 2 people there, gave over $150,000 to this effort over the less than 3 years. One of the major donors was a graduate student from our department, Mike Morris, the person in the beard near the top. The editor, the chief executive officer of the major newspaper in the region, Paul Tash, the Huff family. So we have a lot of enlightened individuals who have made, have greatly improved our ability to serve underrepresented minorities. Now the striking person near the top of the slide is the Vice Mayor of St. Petersburg, Florida, Dr. Kanika Tomlin. And she was pivotal in securing a $125,000 gift from the city of St. Petersburg that will be given over the next 5 years to increase the endowment for Bridge to the Doctorate. So we're incredibly thankful to her for her efforts that are going to make the College of Marine Science a much better place for all of us. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the skin diver in the lower left. That's one of our first underrepresented minority PhDs, Camille Daniels. She actually, although she was incredibly poor, she was so motivated and inspired by this program that she gave some of her money to the endowment for Bridge to the Doctorate. So anyway, this is, to me, an incredible, and I think we can all be thankful that people here have done so much to advance not just marine science, but our society. Finally, there is a testimonial I'd like to give, and that's to Dr. Hicks. He was the person who started the Bridge to the Doctorate program in 2003. And I think we can all be thankful for his major contribution to our society. And for me, he serves as an inspiration for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I must say you serve as an inspiration for all of us as well. I hope that others follow suit, follow your example, and that your great ideas are replicated elsewhere. I think it makes a huge difference. And obviously from the numbers you showed, you've created an enormously successful legacy. So I congratulate you.
Well, Chris, you need to watch the TED Talk that Karina gave, or the things that Regina is doing, or Nikisha's great group of students at St. Mary's College, and you realize that the kinds of things we think, oh boy, get a PhD and you're going to be a scientist, though they're doing so much more than that. And to me, that's what's really exciting about this. And anyway, it's great to see it happen, and I can only hope that we can magnify this.
Good, good. Kathy, how are we for time? I got to ask that question. I think she just told me.
So we're okay.
We're okay. Well, now we get to see somebody who is in that program, that fantastic Bridge to the Doctorate program, April Ellis, who, oh, by the way, happens to be one of our alumni, which is just great, and a very successful one, and also is an alumna of Emory University in Public Health. And she is interested in the intersection between environmental and human health, which is a very hot topic. And we are fortunate to have also Nikisha Williams, who is now an assistant professor, as Peter mentioned, at St. Mary's College of California. And she is a PhD alumna of that wonderful program in South Florida. And by the way, she also did a postdoc with us at LSU, so she has an LSU connection as well. And I've asked them to give some of their thoughts about what that program means to them, about their experiences as underrepresented minority students throughout their careers. And they put together a PowerPoint, and I'll let them take it from here.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Is April Ellis, and Dr. Nikisha Williams will also be joining me. And we wanted to give a current and former Bridge to Doctorate fellow student perspectives. So we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. Next slide. So we're just going to do, here's our agenda for today, just some background introductions, the importance of mentorship, recruiting people of color in the geosciences, and then we're going to open the floor to you guys to ask us any and all questions that you guys have. And this is very, very important to us that you guys are more active in this conversation. So I'll go first, just an introduction of me. I got my bachelor's of science from LSU in coastal environmental science. And I also have my master's of public health and environmental health from Emory University Rollins School of Public Health. And I'm currently a PhD student in the biological oceanography part of the College of Marine Science here at the University of South Florida. But I am working with USF Health, where my actual lab is, working with Dr. Larry DeShaw. So I focus more on the human interactions between marine science and public health to see microplastics is where my research lies. And now I'll introduce Dr. Nikisha Williams to give an introduction on herself.
Hi there. Good day, everyone. My name is Nikisha Williams. Just to give a background again, just like April. So currently I am an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental and Earth Sciences at St. Mary's College of California. I was the second faculty to be hired in this department. There was only one person before. And so I joined about almost 3 years ago. And so that allowed me to broaden the scope of classes offered to the students. So I teach any class from, say, basic introductory classes to wetlands, to hydrology, to GIS. And so my background is that I got a bachelor's in science in environmental studies from SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry, a very specialized schools in environmental science in Syracuse, New York. I acquired a master's in watershed hydrology from North Carolina State. And then I completed my PhD in marine science with a focus on chemical oceanography from USF CMS while I was there. And so my background has been pretty interdisciplinary. I love water, I love all things water. And so I focus a lot on freshwater and saltwater and making the connection between terrestrial areas and coastal environments. So we could go ahead, April.
Okay, so the first part we wanted to talk about is mentorship, which is all about building that relationship. And for me, this is one of the most important things that I've had the pleasure of having throughout my career. I would not be where I am right now without the amazing mentors that I have had throughout my academic career. So by far the most important thing that I cannot stress enough is mentoring your students of color, because that is literally what helps them move on. And so I just want to highlight some of the pictures that I have on the slide. So on your right side, you'll see I have a picture with Dr. Candace Hunter. She is also in the public health service. I worked at CDC for 2 years throughout my master's degree at Emory University. And Dr. Candace Hunter, she is also the head of the Microplastics in Health initiative at CDC, which is where I worked at. And in this photo, you can see that we won an actual cross-agency award this past March of 2019, in excellence of cross-agency between CDC and ATSDR. Without her mentorship and being there for me the past 2 years in my master's degree, and pushing me and encouraging me, I would not be where I am now. And also Dr. Chris Delia, the head of everything right now, has just been a huge mentorship from me through undergrad to now, because I have had that need to be heard and to be told that I am worthy of being where I am. And so it's very important to highlight that. And mentors not only guide academics, but they're also expand the students' networks. So for me, my networking has been through the roof through all of my mentorships, whether it's through my college or the internships that I've had throughout my career. So I think that's very important. And mentors communicate clearly and truthfully to students as they serve as advocates. So if you're there to communicate with your students and to be their advocate when they feel that they're not worthy enough or something is not going right, that is the purpose of mentors. And that's just kind of what I want to highlight on this. It's very, very important for mentorship. Next slide.
And so just to kind of come off of April's mentorship story, I also want to highlight and also bring forward what mentorship look like from a network perspective. And so this slide is pretty busy, but I wanted to highlight the various people who have made a major impact on my life. And so in the very beginning, as an undergrad, I had Dr. Carmen McCoy Harrison at the time. She was at SUNY ESF. She was the Chief Diversity Officer. And through her, I was able to connect to a summer research program, which was one of my first summer research experience ever at SUNY Albany. While I was there as undergraduate research, I had my first meeting with Dr. Chris Delia. So he is a node in early on in my career that was evident and that took place in my undergrad. And so once I was done at SUNY ESF, I applied for various graduate school. I got into North Carolina State University. My major advisor at that time was Dr. Stacy Nelson. And so as I matriculated through that program, when I was almost to completion, he said, I have a colleague and she's looking for a hydrologist for this project that she's doing based out of Puerto Rico. You are a hydrologist and also you qualify because they have a special program that's there. And so through him, I ended up getting connected to Dr. Ashanti Purtle, who was my major advisor at the time. And so I ended up at the College of Marine Science. And again, there I met Dr. Chris Delia at it was like a little reception that they had and we interacted again. So I had 2 meetings with Dr. Chris Delia at that time. After I was finished with my PhD, I was able to obtain a postdoctoral position at the City College of New York, where I met Dr. Karen Block. She also had some connections to Dr. Ashanti Purtle. And so that helped with that, that again, transition from the PhD into the postdoc. While I was there in New York City, I spent 4 years as a postdoc and as a visiting professor. Chris sent me an email and he said, what are you doing? You're teaching too much. You need to come to LSU. And so through him, I met Dr. Kenny Rose, and Kenny became my second postdoctoral advisor. And so I spent some time there at LSU. We worked together on a grant, got some funding. I was brought into LSU. And then this led up to my, really prepared me for my tenure track position. So the reason why I am discussing and bringing forward this network, because I wanted to highlight how important the mentorship component is to the network, and then getting students from the undergrad to an actual position. It's a pipeline, right? And along that pipeline, there are various nodes, nodes being the people. And so through that, those series of relationships, I think was very, very impactful for me. And it was very important for me to get from being an undergrad to now an assistant professor, because getting a tenure track position right now is very, very challenging in general. And so you have to be very competitive. You have to be prepared for these types of positions. So I just wanted to highlight how important these mentorship relationships network really are important, and how essential it is for student success, whether a student end up in a tenure track position or even working for the federal government or anywhere, just being successful in general. You could go ahead, April.
Okay, so we're going to tag team this next slide. So we wanted to touch base on the recruiting and retaining of students, retaining students of color in the geosciences. And now we want to highlight this as considerations. I wanted to go ahead and start by talking about talent is subjective. I find this an important topic to hit on, is that when you're looking at a student, you need to look at them as a whole student. We've already had these discussions that when it comes to me personally, I am not a person that does well with standardized testing. Now we're looking at getting rid of the GREs, but that is a scary aspect of students of color, and what has limited us and my perspective of going after these fellowships and retaining in graduate school, is that you see these underlying aspects that you must have, and they don't really look at the student as a whole, because you can have a student that doesn't do well on standardized testing, but like me, is an overall great student and is focused and wants to be there. So that's kind of something that we feel that it needs to be addressed. You need to focus on the student as a whole, not just certain aspects of the student. Nikisha, if you want to go to the second point.
And so targeted recruitment is also very, very important, right? And I'm just going to couple this with the second point, which is creating relationships with MSIs, HBCUs, and HSIs. And I say that's, targeted recruitment is important, because you have to go where the students are, because sometimes they don't know where to go to find these types of opportunities, because they don't really often know these opportunities exist. For instance, they're not really sure how a degree in environmental science or the geosciences or oceanography actually translate into an actual position. What does that mean? Are you going to be a professor? What type of work do you do? Because what happens is we have these cultural ideas of what success means, right? Within certain families, like if you're a doctor, a lawyer, engineer, those things are really easy to visualize as a form of success. But what do you do with a marine science degree, right? Where do you end up? What type of work do you do? And so having targeted recruitments, and building relationships with these types of institutions, I think is really, really important. Also, I think about myself, just reflecting back on the network. Now that I am a professor, I am a node for my students. I have an ability to connect them to different people and different institutions. My institution has HSI standing, meaning this is a Hispanic serving institution. So we have about 25% or more of our students being from a Hispanic heritage. And so they look to me to connect them to different people, because they don't have those connections, right? And so right now I have somewhat of an opportunity to direct students to my alma maters, right? So like I can say, okay, if a student is interested in marine science, they go to USF. I was like, you go there because you're gonna get a good education, right? The professors are tough, but you're gonna survive because you're smart. and you're going to get a good education. Or go to LSU, they also have a program, right? So it's, I become a node for them and to create those relationships. And I see myself as a liaison between my institution and the institutions that I were a part of, were a student of. And so that is also very, very important.
Yes, and also to add on to that, when you do have students that come in, you have to treat students of color as any other students. This is something that I don't understand the aspect of why, as a minority student, I have a lot of times I have been looked at as needing extra help or needing to be treated with extra care, sort of like a special needs student. We are not students that need that, right? If we needed extra time, if we needed things like that, we will reach out to you. So it's more important to treat us as a normal student. We're there to learn. We're not there to be showboated around, to be the ones that are tokens, as I like to see it. So when you do have students of color, if you're going to give them special treatment, you need to give all students special treatment. You need to give all students the same treatment across the board. Be their mentorship is number one, but also be their advocate, but don't do too much. In better words of saying, just treat us all the same is what I really want to be noted. And to end on this slide is to be consistent and be conscious of your bias. We all have implicit biases of our own, but if you're going to treat, like I said, if you're going to treat me a certain way, you need to treat all students a certain way. That same way. Keep it consistent and keep your bias in check. You always need to be reminding yourself of these biases. Nikisha, I don't know if you want to add on to that.
Yeah, and just to add on, about treating students of color like any other student, like always remember the students are there to learn, right? They are just as passionate as any other student. And to be consistent in the sense of how you view the student, because, what April could say is that sometimes students talk, right? So just to be frank, students talk amongst themselves. And you will start hearing stuff. These students are exchanging information just casually. And so in the exchange of material, you find that there have been some inequities in how certain students have been treated. And then so it may create conflict at the peer level, right? And so now your peers are looking at students like, you've been given a pass and how come I didn't get that pass? And so it creates tension at the peer level. And so it's just important to be mindful of those things. And I think also about being consistent, like, a standard has been set. And the thing about it is that, and about the bias aspect, for instance, if you have students enrolled in a program or trying to get enrolled to a program, and the standard has been set, it's again, students talk. So when, if you allow students, if you make GRE scores a stumbling block for one group of student and do not do the same thing for another group of student, then, and they talk and they find out, that shows inequity. Case in point, my GRE scores haven't always been stellar. And I got into a program and my GRE score wasn't stellar, but the caveat was that I had to be on academic probation for a year and pass all of my core classes with a B or better, which is required for school. And then so I did that. It wasn't a problem because I knew once I was in a program, I can take the classes, I can do the work, I'm there to learn. But then just having a casual conversation, I found out that one or two of my other peers who were non-individuals of color, they had lower GRE scores than I had at the time, or the same amount, and they got admitted into the program and they weren't put on academic probation. So when you see those types of inequities, when students are talking and these types of inequities come up, it could create some, the students start questioning themselves and saying, well, what's so different about me? So again, being consistent and, making sure that, whatever standards you're setting, you're holding those standards for everyone and not making exceptions for others.
Right. And just to end off on that, I did want to plug that when you put, going back to talent is subjective for just a second, when you put restrictions on students getting them into graduate schools, the more restrictions you have, the less students of color you're going to have come in, so that are going to actually want to apply. Case in point, getting into my PhD program, there are lots of restrictions on having certain scores, and you need to have a background in chemistry and be in a lab, and you have to all this stuff. I didn't have half of those. If I didn't reach out to my graduate schools and tell them, hey, my GRE score isn't this way and I don't have lab experience, then they wouldn't have told me that it's okay. But when students are looking at a paper and it's saying you need to have this, and this, when you're putting limitations on what they need to have, you're just asking to have less minority students to apply. So just being open and saying that, we look at your application as a whole, not just on these pinpointing aspects, are also an important thing to consider. But we want to end on asking you guys questions. We want to hear from you guys if we do have time. I don't know where we are. But if anybody has questions that they want to ask me and Dr. Williams, please unmute yourself or raise your hand.
We're running a little over time, but I want to have a couple of questions. And I wanted to recognize Monty Graham because he asked a question that I know is a big issue with URM students. So Monty.
Hey, thanks, Chris. Thank you all. That was a really fantastic sort of personal overview, and I learned a lot from that. So kudos. And also, I know that in graduate school, if I was put in this kind of form, I'd have been terrified. So great job of getting a good message across. So the question is, in April, you touched on it with your comment about the pipeline. And so one of the elements that's missing here is we don't have, I don't think, much private sector representation here. But when you get a PhD, if we're talking about doctorates, if you get a PhD, there's quite a few opportunities outside of just academia. And so I'm kind of curious on your own perspectives of when you were being recruited, was your decision process based on the graduate student funding that you were being offered, or some other element of opportunity while in graduate school? Or were you thinking also about the end of that pipeline, the job, and DEI is such a huge issue on the job side as much as it is on the university training side, and we're missing them unless it's a university that's looking to hire you. But Nikisha, you're up at an agency. You're working in an agency. It's still a huge deal. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts on what got you in the door and settled in an academic program versus what's on the other side.
So for me,
go ahead, Nikisha.
Sorry. So for me, it was like, I didn't know I was going to end up into assistant professor. It just ended up that way. But if you had asked me, I was going to work for the United Nations and I was going to bring fresh water to everybody in the world. For me, it's like, I think I went in, I loved the research, and I so happened to start mentoring students, and I started seeing the gaps in the students' knowledge. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if they want to go to grad school, we need to fill in these gaps. So my view started to change in how can I prepare the next generation to start filling in these places, whether it's being academia or in a private organization. You have to get them ready to get there. And so for me, I think it has been more, not necessarily intentional, but I think as I went along my way, I started developing these types of interests. But when I mentor students and I tell, they ask me, do I want to go into academia? I'd say, do what you like, do what fits for you. If you think you want to teach, that's fine, but also know that you could go into organizations, you could work for the federal government, you could go to, I do not limit the students. I want them to be, find what fits for them. And I tell them success is going to look very different on each of you. So don't compare yourself, figure out what works for you and what is meaningful for you and the type of work you want to do. And so that's how I went about it.
I'll just add that for me in my graduate career, from my master's of public health and now into my PhD, it wasn't so much of the money, but the money does help a lot, because going in for my master's was a professional degree that I paid for with my own student loans. But my PhD, it was also important for me to have funding coming in. Now, that's another restriction that a lot of these programs have. You have to have money coming in, right? So for me, being on the fellowship, I got into the fellowship because my PI did not have funding at the time. He was still working on grants. But in order to get into the college, you have to have funding. So that's another restriction that we feel as minority students, is a lot of these professors have implicit biases of what do you need to have coming in order for me to fund you, right? So I think for me, it was getting into my graduate school, I knew that I wanted to apply public health into marine science from my undergrad. But also that's a process in the making. I didn't know that I wanted to go into public health until my junior year of college. And then I didn't know if I wanted to get my PhD until I realized, being a TA, that I loved teaching students and getting to know students. So it's kind of a cross between the two. So I think it's just important to look at both aspects in retaining students and recruiting them as well. Oh, Chris,
Yeah,
you're
we're
muted.
we're about 10 minutes over where we are supposed to be. So I think we better take a short break now, and then we can have our breakout groups. And if you're not in a breakout group and you would like to, please contact Hannah and she will put you in one. We have capacity, I think, to handle everybody here at this point. And I really appreciate our speakers, all of them. I thought it was very interesting series of talks. And if Kathy would put up the next presentation thing, I just want to introduce what we're doing next. Kathy, you there? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so we will be having two breakout groups. We'll start a little bit later, about say 2:50 or just a little bit after that. And one will be led by David Yaskowitz and the other by Dr. Debbie Thomas. And David is the head of the Heart Research Institute now. He has a wonderful long career in economics, and one time was head economist at NOAA, and he is now one of the principals in GOMERC, and very glad to have his participation here. Next is Debbie Thomas, who's the dean of the Texas A&M University College of Geosciences, and she's a geologist, and she's extremely interested in this topic and will be leading the other discussion groups. So I'm extremely excited about these discussion groups, and what I hope will happen is you will develop ideas that we can go forward with. What might be fundable as a research proposal or an activity? What new approaches might we take to have more success in the overall geosciences in recruiting underrepresented minorities, so on and so forth. So with that, let's take a quick break, and then we'll see you soon, about 10 minutes or so.